So this is a little bit of an unofficial tip, but I found it incredibly useful when working on all sorts of projects where I'm having to iterate quite quickly. One of the things that is, I really only save for the final print, if I can possibly avoid it, is this stuff is called support material. And so when this thing is building in this direction, it's building up, it gets to a point where it goes, hang on a minute, I can't print in mid-air, otherwise I'm going to get a stringy spaghetti mess and all sorts of little defects here. So basically it puts in this thing called support, which you can kind of infer that if the gap is basically bigger than this, support material will exist, whereas it didn't put any with this, as it was able to, as it were, sort of just bridge the canyon with the filament before hitting the next piece, so it didn't create a mess. So basically these are very useful, and essentially all you do is you just pop them out like that. You can see that they just come away and you're left with the finished thing. You might need to still sand it, tidy it up. However, the tip that I end up using to still reduce the amount of support material is I could have just made this buttress here, this little boss, to screw things in, completely square and just floating in mid-air, in which case it would have built support all the way up to this point. And instead what I've done is realised that if you do an angle which is less than 45 degrees, it'll probably put support material because it's too big an overhang. But if you do it 45 degrees or steeper, so as in 50 and beyond, then it basically doesn't bother. And so it builds out layer and layer and layer and layer and step, all the way up, and it means that effectively I've incorporated the support into the model. Now, the slight downside is when you hold this up to the light, you can see a little bit more shadowing, but generally speaking, that's not usually a huge problem. But what's really good about this is that, I was speaking to Alex about this, who's been helping with some of the printing, and he was really pleased that I did this, and I didn't know this. I just, learnt it from experience that I got better quality print. But he said, actually, what you're doing is by every time essentially you put support, the filament is getting squirted out, but then also retracted to basically not put too much material so that it sticks. So you get a lot of what's called retraction errors, where it's pulling the filament back, whereas if you incorporate the model, it basically doesn't do that retraction. It keeps pumping out and laying the filament in place. So in short, the trick is if you can put your support and design things knowing where you're going to build it, what orientation it is. And in case you're wondering, well, why did I pick this particular orientation to build this? As a general rule, I try and use the bed of my printer as the visual face, or the most visual face. So you can appreciate there's a bit of a compromise on, would I like a smooth top where the buttons are, or would I like a clean face where the display screen is? And I chose display screen because I think your eye is naturally more driven to look at that, drawn to that. And again, because of that, everything has been built in this direction, which is why all the bosses taper in that way. So I think this is like a really sort of underutilized tip, and I think it saves you a lot of material, reduces waste, and still you are nonetheless getting rigidity in doing this, but it does require that little bit of presence of mind to design things so that there isn't interference or collisions when you're doing all this. Also, it's quite hard to see here that sometimes you might think you have support material. This is a little socket just to, if you imagine my fingernail is grabbing into this and it just keeps everything flush. But if you're talking about a gap of only a millimetre high, or even a couple of millimetres, it often doesn't need support material because it spans the gap. So I'd even say try experimenting a little bit with what's the maximum size that you can get away with without using support material, because it will really help the quality of your prints in the long run.